All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the river. Gonna be rowing on down today. It's kind of the twilight of the season, late August or mid to late August, and don't have too many more days where I can record on the river. So when I do my future podcasts, I'll probably be doing something else other than river stuff until next summer. So today I want to talk about how do we fix America's railroads? And this is kind of an interesting subject because we do have quite an extensive network of railroads, lots of trackage, not as much as we used to have. It definitely has declined from the peak of trackage that we used to have. But still, American railroads are nothing to sneeze at with regards to, how much freight they move and how we don't really move a lot of people on them anymore. That's going to change. But the question in a lot of urbanism and rail advocacy circles comes up of how do we fix Americans' railroads? And typically you get two responses. Usually they're very much so coupled. First of all is nationalization, and second is electrification. Now, to explain to those of you who don't know what nationalization is, it's something that you should really have a lot of experience with because most of us use a nationalized infrastructure network every single day, which is the American highway system. That is a national asset. It is a federally owned and state maintained system. Of course, there are county roads, state highways, and then the interstates. So there are various operators and owners of these highways, but typically, the Department of Transportation of a state tends to maintain roads, and like counties will have their branches of DOTs to maintain roads. But yes, the roads are nationalized. The highways are nationalized. And that's something that we kind of all need to be aware of and accept. That's one thing, like the railroads are privately owned, the highways are nationally owned. The highways don't pay for themselves. The highways stimulate economic development around them. And then there's taxes on fuel, and then various grants and other forms of our income taxes all go to paying for roads. So the fuel tax does not maintain the highway network like it was intended to. It is a network of grants and subsidies and various infrastructure bills that maintain the highway system. The highways are not standing on their own. The only highways that do stand on their own are toll roads, whether they are privately owned or publicly owned, and even then certain toll roads are still subsidized by taxpayers, regardless if they own a vehicle or not, regardless of the fact, a motorcyclist and somebody who owns a F-350, if they both earn the same amount of money from their jobs, then they both are paying income taxes that get redistributed on a federal level to various grant programs to maintain the highways, even though the motorcyclist is doing a fraction of the damage to the roads as the F-350. But that's just explaining nationalization and how we do live in a country that already has one nationalized infrastructure system. If you want to get really technical, you could say that airports are nationalized as well, with regards to how many subsidies the municipalities and local governments spend to maintain their airports, if you want to look at it that way. But yes, typically in urbanism and rail advocacy circles, when it comes to improving America's railways, usually it's nationalization and electrification. Now, nationalization is more of a matter of being able to have the railroads exit private ownership and enter public ownership, where the finances turn different when it comes to upgrades, where a freight railroad will basically do the bare minimum of maintenance that they need to do and the bare minimum upkeep and improvements to satisfy their customers. You're not going to see a lot of things like double track or high-speed rail segments for freight trains, because as far as the freight companies are concerned, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And they're trying to get the most profit out of the least amount of infrastructure. So you'll see them actually cannibalize themselves and rip up rail and kind of downgrade rail in terms of speed and capacity because if that speeding capacity is not needed to meet their obligations, then why bother, maintaining it and funding it? In a sense, you could say, like, if a highway was privately owned, then essentially whoever owned it would do the bare minimum of maintenance and of that highway and possibly reduce its capacity, which might actually be a good thing. Can we privatize the highways and nationalize the railways? And that way, like, the freight companies can do what they did to the railways to the highways. We're like, well, does this highway really need to be 8 lanes wide? We can get away with 2, so let's rip up the others, because that's kind of what the freight railways did. Where, oh, we have this nice good section of double track. Do we really need 2 tracks here? That's twice the track maintenance. Let's cut it down to 1. So yeah, we should get the CEOs from Union Pacific and BNSF to be at the chairman of the board for the Department of Transportation, or whatever position they have to that, where they can just start cutting up highways and cutting them down to size, which probably would be a good thing. Yeah, can we get a role reversal, a little bit of a flip-flop going on there? But still, the idea behind nationalization is that national priorities and use of railroads would dictate what the actual infrastructure looks like, instead of a private company trying to extract the maximum amount of money from the least amount of infrastructure. So you would see things like double tracking, reactivation of certain rail corridors that aren't, freight heavy, but could provide lots of passenger service. And you'd see passenger service and freight service kind of, either be equal priorities or passenger service becoming a higher priority. Basically, the default would not be freight is the priority if the railroads were nationalized. And then the second part of this is electrification, which would piggyback off of a lot of those improvements made in nationalization. Like, okay, we double track this section that used to be single track, and now the entire thing is electrified. So most urbanists are very much so in favor of nationalization. Now, I see the benefits of nationalization, but I also see the political hurdles of nationalization, where people are going to be screaming socialism and communism. And how dare you do this? Now, I would say, like, well, the highways already are nationalized. So, those, very much so right-wing pickup truck driving, American flag waving, good old country boys need to realize that, like, well, your state highways and federal interstates are already nationalized. So, curb your enthusiasm. In fact, in other countries, like in Germany, it's known as the Autobahn in a lot of places, but in Germany, also, a lot of roads are actually called, from the get-go, federal highways. I mean, they call the highway the federal highway. Well, they say that in German, but still, it's like there is no subterfuge in the marketing. Everybody knows that is a federally owned road. And in America, like, call it genius marketing, or borderline. What's the word? What I'm looking for here? It's not marketing. Not subterfuge, but it's intentionally deceptive that the interstate highway system is not called, the federal highways, even though it was the federal, Interstate Act. It's like we call it I-70. We don't call it Federal Highway 70. And maybe if we did call it Federal Highway 70, then we'd be like, oh yeah, that's owned by the government, owned and operated and maintained by the government. That is a nationalized infrastructure asset. So that being said, I still think that there'd be a lot of pushback from both the freight companies and the right wing, and people who just really don't understand how the roads work in the first place. I have my serious doubts that the rail network in this country will ever be nationalized. And a non-nationalized railway makes it very difficult for things like Amtrak and other operators to succeed, because they're, at this point, you're talking about Amtrak is usually kind of borrowing a freight railroad's track. The freight railroad is the host railroad, and they let Amtrak use it under, a certain set of rules dictated by the host railroad, because, well, it's our railroad, not yours. we're going to run our freight trains, and your passenger train has to wait. And that's one of the reasons why passenger trains are so slow in America. There's really two reasons. The first reason, of course, is that, freight tends to take priority over a passenger train because Amtrak is operating on a railroad that they don't own. That's the first issue. So, even if, you're on a section of track where, say, you could go 79 miles an hour, you can't go 79 miles an hour if there's a freight train in your way and you've got to wait on a passing siding. So that's one of the issues that makes Amtrak so slow and would lead to its lack of competition with cars and planes. The second side of that, of course, is since a lot of this infrastructure is privately owned, there's different classifications of track that specify what speed you can go at, and like class 4, class 6, like class 1, different classes of track. And again, these freight railroads are not incentivized to increase the class of their track for the benefit of Amtrak, because it's like we have a 2 mile long freight train, as long as it gets to its location at an agreed upon time, or like even an agreed upon day, who really cares how fast it, as long as it got there. And like this is the precision scheduled railroading. It's big, slow moving freight trains that move a lot of stuff with very few crew from point A to point B. And as long as they get to point B at the agreed upon time, everything's fine. Which means that the freight railroad is not incentivized to upgrade their track for speed, which is kind of crazy considering, when the freight railroads were first built, they would compete with each other, and you actually have like parallel lines, not necessarily right next to each other, but you'd have two different freight railroads that are competing against each other, and one of their marketing tools to get customers for their freight and also their passengers was speed. So you'd have freight railroads investing in building better track, higher speed track, putting more powerful, faster locomotives on that track during like the golden age of steam. And it's kind of funny that when we were using steam power back in the day, in like the 30s, 40s, and 50s, like the era of beginning the superpower era of steam, it's funny how those freight trains were faster than what we have now. And there was more flexible scheduling because, you would have smaller trains moving faster on better track, running more trains per day. And that was when the freight railroads were really a powerhouse. Freight railroads have kind of descended into a shadow of their former self, where now they're, instead of being run by railroaders, they're run by, investment firms and Wall Street accountant bros and all the crap that comes with Wall Street. It's like, how do we do the least amount of work for the maximum amount of profit? Which is a discussion for another time about how that entire Wall Street philosophy of, the reason why nothing ever gets done in this country is because you have this philosophy of how can I do the least amount of work for the most amount of money? That has really permeated our society since the late 60s. And it's kind of a cancer because, as much as the boomers want to call us all the millennials lazy, they were the ones that were at the helm of the, investment firm attitude to life of I need other people to work for me, and I'm the fat cat. I sit back and relax and watch the dividends come in, where all I care about is my rate of return on a stock. I don't care how they made the money. But yeah, that's kind of the cannibalization of American industry of, let's do less and get paid more for it, which sounds great until you realize that, you had to cannibalize your entire industry. And that was, again, like a one-time trick. And once the industry is cannibalized, well, you can't really do that again. So you had a nice rates of return by sacrificing your own industry for a while until there was no more industry left to sacrifice. And then there go the sweet, sweet returns. And now you basically, have to put all that money back in that you took out to build the industry back up. And then hopefully we don't repeat the cycle and start cannibalizing the industry again. Because that's basically defined America for the last 50 years, 50 to 60, maybe even 70 years of cannibalizing our own industry and then wondering why we have all these society scale problems. And the freight railroads cannibalizing themselves for sake of Wall Street power bro, economics is definitely part of that problem. Okay, kind of went on a tangent there, but I think it's relevant. But still, the freight railroads used to be these powerhouses with parallel routes, competition, high-speed trains, high-speed lines, and this was all in the era of steam. It seems like once diesels came along, everything just slowed down by comparison. I mean, yes, diesels can go faster than steam engines, but still, it's like, do we actually use that speed? Because again, with the active precision scheduled railroading, and also the consolidation and deregulation of railroads, where they all started merging together, it's like, well, if you don't have anyone to compete against, if you are like BNSF or Union Pacific or like the big four, there's CSX, Norfolk Southern, BNSF, and Union Pacific, like they basically bought out all their competitors, so they have no incentive to compete, both in terms of price or speed or convenience to their customers. At the same time, they got rid of their passenger services because those weren't making money. So now, the modern freight railroads are a stunted mediocrity of their former selves. They've like descended into being the worst aspects of big railroads instead of, using the power that big railroads can do. It's all about efficiency and saving money and, blah, 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 network fluidity. It's sickening. Modern railroads are not railroads. They are basically gigantic investment firm puppets. But back to nationalization. The idea of nationalization is that it may be a tool that could reinvigorate the infrastructure in a way that market competition once did. But then again, there's so much pushback to doing that. Fair warning, there's a fishing boat ahead of me, and I don't really want to be talking while I pass them. And fishing boats are known for being pretty slow. They're fly fishing, so I'll try to get past them really quickly. So maybe just enjoy the river ambiance while I get around them without making too much noise. I just don't want to mess with the concentration of the fishermen. One of the side effects of recording a podcast in the real world outside the studio, I don't control all the variables. So it's like they're going slow, but just not fast enough for me to not worry about them, not slow enough for them to be easy to pass. So I'm having to put in some elbow grease to get past them. So we'll see. I'm going to kind of take the inside route, even though that's not where the current is. Since I'm under power, I'll just take the shorter route, and we'll see where we get. Alright, now we're making headway. Cool. So yeah, if market competition was the original force that made the railroads run faster, upgrade their track, upgrade their locomotives, upgrade their schedules, and then it was a combination of the competition from the nationalized highway network and also the deregulation that allowed all these railroad companies to merge together, which kind of destroyed the incentive for railroads to have high-speed freight service. At that point, it was like, okay, if we're not getting, these damn truck things are stealing our profit margin, and we bought out all our competitors, so what's our incentive to run fast on parallel tracks? Well, there wasn't one. So then, as all these railroads were coming on hard times, they brought in the Wall Street, accountants and speculative investors to fix everything and restructure the company. And lo and behold, we ended up with the modern freight railroads we have today, which is a problem. And as I mentioned in a previous podcast, how, with the decline of trucking coming upon us due to the fuel crisis, railroads are going to kind of get I'm not going to say a lifeline because they don't really need it, but they're definitely going to get an injection of cash by the increased amount of freight that's going to be put back onto trains and taken away from trucks, just because due to a combination of the energy crisis, which is making diesel more expensive, and the lack of truck drivers, even if autonomous self-driving electric trucks come on the scene, they cannot compete with the efficiency of a freight train powered by diesel, electricity, or otherwise, in terms of manpower and in terms of energy expended per moving ton of cargo per mile. I mean, the self-driving trucks are probably going to find their niche. I can definitely see either electric trucks or self-driving trucks doing well for like last mile delivery stuff in a city. But even then, that will also be in the warehouse district, because actually driving through downtown streets to deliver food to restaurants, you need a person there to, you know, pull the little forklift dolly off the back and move a crate of potatoes into a restaurant. I mean, unless the restaurants are going to have their own crews to unload a self-driving truck that shows up. Hopefully it didn't run over too many children as it was driving through downtown Denver. But still, like, I have my doubts that nationalization will ever occur. It just seems like too much of a political issue. The only thing that could really do that would be like World War III, where you have like another time, like in the Second World War, where the railroads kind of became under the direction of the federal government and the military because they had to operate efficiently to fight the war. So pending, like, you know, an outbreak of World War III, nationalization is probably not going to happen. And I'll circle back to this after a bit when I talk about how nationalization, like a version of nationalization, could occur. But the second thing I want to talk about that a lot of rail advocates and urbanists talk about is electrification. And usually electrification is, you know, something pinned underneath nationalization, as if electrification will only ever occur to America's railroads if they were nationalized, like they are in Europe. Because the individual private companies don't seem to have enough foresight to see that the big investment in electrification now will save them buku bucks in the future. They'd rather just, you know, kind of like the frog boiling in the pot of water as diesel prices continue to rise. It's like, you know, we'll just keep burning diesel. You know, it's getting a little bit more expensive every year, but, you know, we don't really want to throw at the cash. Like, basically, while I'm CEO, I won't see the return of electrifying all of Union Pacific. Therefore, I don't want to do it. I'd rather get, you know, a short-term return rather than a long-term return that will benefit stockbrokers, or no, stockholders, and the next CEO, or maybe the CEO after that. It's again that selfish hubris of humans, where it's like, because I won't see the benefit in my lifetime, I don't see a reason to do it. So that's kind of the way how the big four see electrification. Like, they all agree it's like a good idea and that it would reduce operating costs in the future, but nobody wants to spend the money now to benefit future generations and the operators that will take over after they retire. They just can't see that far in the future. And the idea behind nationalization would be that, well, you know, a publicly owned asset would see the advantage of electrification in the future. Also, a publicly owned rail network would have the money and would be able to streamline the process to get that done over time. So that's why, like, say electrification could only ever happen under nationalization. Basically, they're saying that, you know, it'd be a much easier argument in the national sphere. And that's why you see railroads basically trying to do everything they can to avoid electrification. They're looking at, you know, hydrogen-powered locomotives, biofuel-powered locomotives, battery-powered locomotives. Basically, like, what's something that costs less than electrification that can still get us away from diesel? Even if, you know, the long-term operating costs of this other thing, this, you know, if diesel is option A, electrification is option B, what option C can we find that costs less than B, probably costs more than A, but probably long-term still costs more than B? It's, again, that short-term, you know, Wall Street bro attitude of, like, I don't need to fix the problem, I just need to fix it enough to keep the shareholders happy and, you know, get some good PR. Like, oh, look, Union Pacific's green now. We have like 5 battery electric locomotives. Woohoo! And Canadian Pacific has experimented with their hydrogen fuel cell. Now, personally, I think that hydrogen fuel cell is probably a much better route to follow than batteries. I just think it's much easier to build 1,000 fuel cell locomotives than it is 1,000 battery electric locomotives, because for the most part, those hydrogen fuel cells are going to last a lot longer than the batteries. And the big issue with hydrogen being used for personal vehicles is that, like, well, you got to build all these hydrogen refueling stations. The benefit of a railroad is that, well, just put a hydrogen refueling station in every single one of your rail yards, and even though they're probably pretty big and expensive, you don't have to put one on every single street corner of America, like if you were trying to completely power the American automotive fleet with hydrogen. So hydrogen fuel cell makes a lot more sense for big industry in terms of like cargo ships and freight trains than it does for personal vehicles. Now, semi-trucks running on hydrogen fuel cells can kind of get the same argument from freight. Like, well, if you're going from, freight hub to freight hub, then you don't, and if you can get the range out of the hydrogen, then you really don't need to build that many refueling stations. So again, I think hydrogen is probably a better route for the freight railroads to go than batteries, because batteries will wear out. Batteries are expensive, batteries are heavy. And the freight railroads could do like two things at once. One, they could, build out all their hydrogen infrastructure at all their yards, but also, they might only need like one or two massive facilities that produce hydrogen, preferably, green hydrogen or pink hydrogen. Green hydrogen refers to, hydrogen made by electrolysis, powered by solar panels and wind turbines and hydro. And pink hydrogen refers to hydrogen produced by electrolysis powered by nuclear. Because the hydrogen produced by electricity produced by, I'm not sure if it's blue hydrogen or gray hydrogen or black hydrogen, but there's a scale of all the different hydrogens. I know green and pink. But if you produce your hydrogen either by like refining natural gas or some other petrochemical and ripping the hydrogen atoms off of a petrochemical, that doesn't really count because you're still using a hydrocarbon. And if you're using a coal-fired power plant or a natural gas-fired power plant to produce electricity to do the electrolysis, then also that hydrogen really doesn't make sense. It's only the green hydrogen and the pink hydrogen that I think really makes a lot of sense for this. But, the railroads could both, power themselves with hydrogen, while at the same time being, since they're distributing their own fuel on their own network, they could also, they could have like one or two really big green or pink hydrogen facilities, where the pink facility doesn't necessarily mean that they're running their own nuclear reactor. They're just, that facility is hooked up to somebody else's nuclear reactor, and that like 90+% of the energy going into that electrolysis facility is from a nuclear reactor. But the idea is that they would both distribute hydrogen for their own purposes and their own consumption, but also they could, now that they're moving all this hydrogen around, if there were any other uses of hydrogen, like, the freight lines could now deliver, tank cars full of compressed or liquid hydrogen to a transport hub and fuel cargo ships and semis. So it's like, if they got into hydrogen and they're really good at moving all this hydrogen around from their facilities that produce hydrogen, then, now they've got a commodity they can move around. It's like moving coal back in the day, where, both the railroads burned coal and a lot of other people burned coal. So moving coal around was profitable. So if the railroads want to find a much better solution for decarbonizing, I think that batteries is kind of a dead end. But hydrogen makes a lot of sense because they could get paid money to move hydrogen around that both they use and other people use. So it's a win-win. So I can see the gradual migration to hydrogen for the railroads over electrification, because they can. There's multiple revenue streams in that case. Well, I guess you could say one of them is reducing the amount of revenue you spend on diesel, and the other one is now the railroads become essentially the hydrogen distribution network of the country. Because if hydrogen were to ever take off, we're probably not going to have hydrogen pipelines crisscrossing the country. Now, in the future, when maybe we move completely away from natural gas, possibly we could use our natural gas pipeline infrastructure to move around hydrogen. But that's really dangerous because hydrogen is a very small atom, H2, and it's a lot of getting pipe work and valves and seals rated for hydrogen is pretty difficult. methane is a much bigger molecule than H2, so it's harder to it's harder for it to squeeze out through every single little crack and orifice, versus hydrogen is insidious, and even hydrogen will do things like migrate into a solid material, which is really annoying. So you need special materials to make hydrogen-rated pipes and valves. Hydrogen's freaking scary in terms of how insidious it is and how it's really hard to contain, which means that, the future of hydrogen transport is probably going to be based more upon liquefying hydrogen or putting it into rail cars that are specially designed to do it, because it's probably much easier to build a single rail car that can safely contain hydrogen than retrofitting the entire natural gas line pipeline infrastructure in the country to carry hydrogen. Not to say that there won't be hydrogen pipelines in certain locations, but as far as moving hydrogen around the country, it's probably going to be, a huge segment of the railroads freight that they're moving around is just shipping hydrogen around. Hydrogen will be like the coal of the future in terms of the rolling asset that the railroads dominate. So back to electrification, railroads seem to be doing a lot to try to avoid electrification. Thus my hydrogen tangent. And battery locomotives really only make sense for they make sense in 3 categories. First of all is yard shunting. Because, if you imagine a freight railroad yard, there's a lot of parallel tracks. If you actually go to a place that is electrified and you go to an electric freight yard, there is a lot of wires in the air, or there are a lot of wires in the air. It kind of looks like a spaghetti bowl. I mean, take that stereotypical Indian electrical grid joke, and there's apply Kirchhoff's law, and there's a million wires tied up on a telephone pole. Basically take that and put it over a freight rail yard. Like a fully electrified freight yard is kind of a mess. And I understand why a lot of countries that have these are like, oh, good. Yeah. Electric wires can look really elegant when it's, one track with one wire above it. Or if you have something like the Northeast corridor where there's like 4 parallel tracks and 4 parallel wires. But then when you get in a freight rail yard where you've got 10 tracks parallel, it can get kind of hectic. And of course, that's something where, the freight railroads might say, this whole electrification thing kind of messy. So battery electric locomotives in a shunt role, where they're just shunting around cars, building trains, taking trains apart in a freight yard, that's a good application of battery electric technology. You're not going very fast, you're not going very far, the charge station is right there. And a lot of these, the clever designs actually have a section of overhead wire in a part of the yard, so that way the battery electric locomotive can do in-motion charging, or, just stop by and put the pantograph up and charge up without having to get a crew member to, go run an extension cord and plug it into the belly of the locomotive. Just kind of pull over to the charging track and do your thing. Or if there's a section of track that the shunting locomotive is frequently passing through, like a lead track, well, then you electrify that, and every time it passes underneath it, it gets a little bit more juice. Probably won't, be enough to make it run indefinitely, but, probably, give it a little top off every once in a while. Then when shift's over, maybe you switch out the locomotive for another one. You have 2 shunting locomotives, and, one's always charging and one's always moving around and maybe getting some in motion charging. So that's the one application of battery electric locomotives that makes a lot of sense. The second application that makes a lot of sense is the in-motion regenerative braking. Because currently when a locomotive uses its dynamic brakes going down a hill or slowing down, that is just burned off as heat through a massive resistor bank, which is pretty silly. You take all that kinetic energy of a freight train a mile long stopping, and you just burn it off as heat and dump it in the atmosphere. Not a great plan. But you have the Flex Drive by Wabtec, which is designed to be a hybrid consist, not a hybrid locomotive. So that means you could have 4 diesel locomotives and 1 Wabtec Flex Drive train in the middle of them. And when it goes down a hill, the Wabtec puts on its regenerative brakes, or its dynamic brakes, which in this case are regenerative, and hopefully the other 4 locomotives don't put on their dynamic brakes, and you maximize the amount of energy that the Wabtec engine can capture and put into its battery, because the Wabtec engine is essentially one gigantic battery on wheels with a bunch of traction motors and an inverter and rectifier. So that way the Wabtec locomotive just, takes all that kinetic energy as the train rolls down a hill or rolls to a stop. And then on startup, when the train is picking up speed again, the Wabtec engine, assists with the acceleration. The idea being here, of course, that the idea of the Wabtec is that by recovering some energy on the descent or the deceleration, you basically give that energy back on the ascent or acceleration. And you're getting like a fuel savings of like 20%, because, and the other side of a lot of this stuff is that you're reducing the hard running hours of the prime movers of the diesel engines, which is another reason why the freight railroads are like, ooh, nice. Because if you think about it, if you can reduce the amount of hours that a prime mover is working, in its 80+% power range, then that will prolong the life, because running an engine hard decreases its life faster than running it kind of in its happy place in the middle. So that's something else I'm going to circle back to in a bit. But yeah, using one of these Wabtec engines to basically make the lives easier on the diesel engines of the 4 engines in its consist, or 2 or 1, or however many there are, is another thing where the freight railroads are looking, saying, hey, so you're saying that, we'll burn 20% less fuel with one of these engines in our consist, and we'll run the diesel engines, less hard, so they last longer and can go further between maintenance cycles. Sign me up, because they're just seeing dollar signs, which is kind of a way how electrification will happen, is that it'll be a natural financial incentive at some point. So that is the second case for battery electric locomotives making sense as a hybrid consist to regen and help with acceleration to reduce the wear and tear on their diesel counterparts. And the third one that makes a lot of sense is basically when you are running a freight train or a passenger train through an area in which the NIMBYs are so staunchly against electrification that, say you can electrify like 80% of a line, but then when you go through this one neighborhood or this one part of town, they are so against it, you're like, fine, we'll have one battery electric locomotive, or maybe a hybrid, electric locomotive, which is most of the time, like 90% of the time, powered by overhead wires. But then when it has to jump across an unelectrified section, then, we'll have a battery on board, because you guys are just raising hell about putting catenary wires up. That's where, those are my 3 cases for battery electric locomotives making sense. And of course, with that third case, you kind of enter the notion of like battery hopping, or discontinuous electrification, as it's called, where, you essentially go from in-motion charging and running where the overhead wire is powering the train and charging the battery, to the wire goes away, and now you are running off battery power, now you're back under a wire. And maybe it's like, the idea is that in 100 miles of rail, what if you only have to put up 50 miles of wire? You're cutting your electrification costs in half, and maybe you can avoid the most difficult, both in terms of environment or political environment, places to put up wire. So, you can basically, pick and choose where it's easiest to put up electrical cables, which is kind of clever. I don't want to say that like the freight railroads and Amtrak have been like playing the 5D chess move of like, once batteries get good enough, then we can, electrify our system. We only have to electrify half our system to get the effect of a fully electric system, because again, batteries are kind of until we have batteries that don't degrade and are made out of much more ethically sustainable materials and environmentally sustainable materials, then I think being too dependent on batteries is a problem. Especially if you consider that, a pure electric locomotive is a bunch of copper, aluminum, and steel, compared to a battery electric locomotive, which has much more rare earth, special, materials in it. So, I always think we should subscribe to the theory of like, let's build the solution that requires the least exotic materials possible that can be domestically sourced as a matter of national security. So this is kind of leading me to my my own personal opinions on nationalization and electrification. Which, since I was just talking about electrification, I want to continue with that. And I want to kind of combine the theories of the second and third case for battery electric locomotives, where the second case was like the incentive for railroads to electrify is to reduce fuel consumption and reduce the hard hours on prime movers, which are basically the big diesel engines inside of diesel locomotives, to extend their life. You can kind of think of this as your own personal car. Like, if you ran that car on red line or near red line all the time, bad things are going to happen. It's much better to, like, say you've got a vehicle that goes up to 6,000 RPMs, but you rarely ever are there. Even when accelerating, you're probably around 3,000 RPMs, and you probably try to hang out around 1,500 RPMs. That's the big difference between a aircraft engine and a locomotive engine over a streetcar engine. It's like, Dodge might say, oh, we got this truck, it has like a 500 horsepower engine. It's not really a 500 horsepower engine, because most car engines, even supercars, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, whatever, their engines are actually pretty poorly designed. They're not industrial engines. They're engines for rich boys. They look pretty, they sound cool. But the big difference between like an aircraft engine and a diesel engine and a marine engine over a car engine, and even like most trucks are still in like the marine, diesel, and locomotive category, is that, a diesel engine in a ship or a train or a truck or an aircraft engine are designed to operate, like when they say it's like a 300 horsepower aircraft engine, they mean it can operate at like 300 horsepower for like 10 hours straight. That's what separates an aircraft engine and these other engines from car engines. Like, you cannot operate even if it's the Super Cummins Turbo Boy Super F550 lifted truck, that engine cannot operate at its maximum horsepower for probably more than a few minutes, maybe half an hour, maybe an hour if you're lucky. The cooling system and the robustness of the engine just is not there for that engine to really operate in that domain for very long. So that's why horsepower, when it comes to consumer vehicles like cars, is really a marketing term. It's not actually a technical term. Like, my truck technically has 315 horsepower. And probably when you are accelerating, you're using maybe 100 horsepower, and when you're cruising, you're using 50 horsepower. Very rarely do you ever use all 315 horsepower. That's when you are, the engine's revved up, you're redlining the engine, and and you do not want to do that for very long in any vehicle. That's why cars are kind of pathetic, because they have these engines that say they have a lot of power, but they really can't use it for very long. Long-winded way of me saying that, that aside, even then, if you have a diesel engine in a locomotive, it's generally not a good idea to run it at its max power for very long. They can do it better than your own personal car, but, it's still, the guys in the maintenance bay are like, geez. So, typically you want to keep your engine, running, between like 35 and 80% most of the time. Most engines, most internal combustion piston engines, that's their happy place. Like, anything below 35%, it's like, why are you running an engine that big, that slow? You sometimes lose a lot of your thermal efficiency. And anything over 80% is like, why are you running this thing so hard? I mean, yes, you have that 20% margin above 80% for when you really need it, but we really prefer you not use it. So there's a big incentive for freight railroads to try to always keep their engines running kind of in that happy place where it's above 35%, below 80%. You're getting good fuel economy, you're justifying having an engine so big and so robust, but you're also not working it to death. So my second and third point being that, battery electric locomotives in a concept could help alleviate the hard running hours. And the third point, which is, kind of putting electrification where it's easy to put, I end up with kind of my fourth argument for electrification, which is a combination of these two traditional arguments, which is, what if you only electrify rail lines where your engines, your diesel engines, are consistently exceeding 80% throttle, where you're consistently working your engines the hardest. Because that would be something where, it'd be situations in which during this section of track in Nebraska, trains are always accelerating here. Honestly, a lot of this applies in mountain areas, twisty mountain rail lines, stuff where the engine's consistently running under high power. So this is, the ascents and descents of mountain passes. That's one of those places where I think it'd make a lot of sense to electrify, because these are places that are consistently seeing their engines work the hardest. So, for example, from Moffett Tunnel on the east side, descending all the way down into Denver, that'd be a great place to electrify, because that is where locomotives are consistently working pretty hard. Likewise in other mountain passes and steep grades throughout the country, electrify them there, because you can electrify it on the way up and the way down, which is really dependent on the direction of the train. So that means you both have an option to use the grid power to help a train on the way up, and this is where you'd have like a diesel electric hybrid locomotive, where it's a diesel locomotive. It may or may not have a battery pack. This is the big incentive for railroads, where if they don't have to buy the battery packs in the first place. But you can take, your classic, like say -9 locomotive, or any diesel electric locomotive, and put a pantograph on it, and then rejig the power system in there to take mains of power. Say it's at whatever voltage you want to do, 1,000 volts DC, 2,500 volts AC, whatever's easiest to adapt to freight locomotives. And that way, once a diesel locomotive that's coming out of Denver and heading up into the mountains, it hits this patch of electrification, this overhead electric wire, and then basically either they throttle back their engine or they shut off the prime mover altogether. Probably throttle it back, because there's other systems, unless like every single system, like air compressors and all that, can just be run by the electric overhead wire. But then, you basically have this diesel locomotive, tap into the grid power, tap into this, overhead wire, and use that for the power to climb the steep grade. So that way, what normally would be the worst part of the trip for the diesel engine can just take a break and be offline, either running at a very low level or, shut off altogether, which is probably ideal in terms of carbon emissions. So that way the train can just, climb up this hill on the electric wire. And then once it gets to the top, maybe right before, like when in the last mile or so of electrification, they fire up their diesel engine again and continue on their merry way. So not only have they reduced the hardest part of the journey, or eliminated the hardest part of the journey for the engine, they've also reduced probably a majority of their carbon emissions, because when the engine is running at like 80+%, 90%, 95% capacity, that's when it's, pushing out not only the most carbon, but also because of the way how engines work, it's running faster, harder. Your NOx and smog producing agents, soot and unburned diesel. Like typically, when you're running an engine pretty hard is when you're going to get the most interesting stuff coming out of the tailpipe. You've eliminated that too. So you've eliminated a majority of your carbon emissions, because you're avoiding this hard run of your diesel engine, and you've avoided the most exotic emissions. Win-win. And this works in as well for when you're descending, where normally, you wouldn't be using your diesel. Maybe I forget, I know there's the independent brakes, but do freight trains use like compression braking, like J braking? I'm not sure. I know they got their regenerative brakes, but I'm not sure if they got their compression brakes, where you basically, like the engine brake, where you turn an engine into an air compressor, essentially. Not sure if they do that or not. But on the descent, it's one of those things where, imagine a freight train now exiting the Moffett Tunnel, coming down into Denver, hits these overhead wires, throws up its pantograph, and then it regens all the way down into Denver, where you're reducing the, I wouldn't say you're reducing the wear and tear of the traditional brakes, because hopefully you're using your dynamic brakes. That's why dynamic brakes are so popular, because if you use your traditional friction-based brakes, ceramic disc pads and rotors, well, yeah, you each time you use those, you take a little bit more off the brake pad and you take a little bit more off the rotor, and that is material that needs to be replaced, and railroads don't like doing that. So the idea of the dynamic brake was it's a electric resistor that doesn't really, it still needs maintenance, but not as much as traditional brakes that are on cars. And even then, that's why, if you live in Colorado, when you descend a mountain pass in your vehicle, you want an engine brake. You don't want to just ride your brakes, or else you'll be replacing your brake pads and rotors quite frequently, and that gets expensive. It's better to use your engine brake if you have a vehicle that allows you to do that. I know some vehicles, they just have drive and low, and sometimes low is too low, versus having, kind of an ESP, electric shift protocol, where you can kind of pick the effective gear through your automatic transmission, or if you drive manual. But then these railroads will be able to descend into Denver in a safe and controlled manner, all the while feeding energy back into the grid, which I'm not sure you would call that like a renewable source of energy, but as far as the railroad's concerned, regenning is not 100% efficient, but if the railroad was buying electricity from the grid on the way up, they can at least sell some electricity back. Like usually the statistic I see is 30%. So, the railroad would be able to sell back 30% of the energy it used on the way up, which again further incentivizes this form of electrification, because this form of electrification, I'm not going to say it pays for itself, but hey, it's like, if you essentially can say, like, if we electrify, we don't run the diesel engine on the way up or the way down, we only have to put a small section of wires up, and in the end, we only pay 70% of the energy costs on the way up, and the way down is, you could say it's free, or it's like that's what makes the uphill trip 70%. So this is like a market way how I'd incentivize railroads to electrify, of saying like, hey, electrify the sections of your track that are on steep grades or where the engines are consistently working really hard. Your benefits are you don't have to electrify that much. You get essentially, you subsidize your own electricity on the way down, and you are removing the hardest running hours from your prime movers. I plan on making a much more detailed video about this at some point. It's a bit more bite-sized than this long podcast. But that's like, if I were, some investment bro going to Union Pacific, that's the argument I'd make. It's like, hey, retrofit some locomotives to have pantographs that can both, use overhead wires for power and return that energy back to the grid. And then electrify these steep sections of track. You could say, anything that's above a grade of like 2%, maybe even 1%. And maybe it's like a formula, like anything that's above this grade for this long, put wires up, and then, you can be like, this is a win-win. You're extending the life of your diesel engines, and you are basically reducing your energy costs. And you could probably, mop the entire thing up to be a pretty good Greenpeace PR stunt. Like, hey, look, we electrified. And not only that, we electrified like the section of track in which our diesel engines used to work the hardest. But now the diesel engines are off, and there's no emissions. Now we're running up the hill on electricity, and then on our way home, we put it back in the grid. I mean, this is like a super PR win. And you're getting a lot of benefits of electrification without doing much electrification. But I do think that like full electrification would be ideal. But as far as a stopgap measure that's better than battery electric locomotives, I think that this is a pretty good idea. It's relatively simple and not too big in scope. And in a state like Colorado, and also Utah and California, places where there are very steep mountain passes, like just put lines over the mountain passes. All right, I think I've talked enough about electrification, and now I kind of want to get back to the future of nationalization. And it seems like nationalization is not going to happen all at once unless there's a war. And what we're seeing right now is essentially state governments buying up sections of rail line from Class 1 railways, bit by bit. Like currently in 2025 is going to be when the Moffat Tunnel is next up for grabs. And the state of Colorado is looking at acquiring the tunnel. that I think Union Pacific leases for like 10 grand a year, which is just ridiculous. It's something like that was the original contract written back in 1925 when 10 grand a year was a lot of money, but apparently the contract never mentioned to be adjusted for inflation. But it's like one of those like 100-year-old contracts that Union Pacific is not going to get the same sweet deal on the Moffett Tunnel in 2025 that they got back in 1925 or whenever Rio Grande was probably the last one to negotiate it. And yeah, 10 grand per year in $1925. Oh, yeah, this is before the Great Depression, and that was a lot of money back in those days. I don't have the inflation calculation off the back of my head, but still. But yeah, states are buying up sections of rail bit by bit. They're buying, either high-profile rail like the Moffett Tunnel, or maybe they're trying to grab up little bits and pieces of disused rail. And you see this a lot with, cities and municipalities buying up used freight lines and using that as a starting point for their own light rail network, or maybe an Amtrak extension, or something else between light rail and Amtrak, like the Rail Runner or the Front Runner, where you run like heavy rail but not yet Amtrak, still like commuter rail. I prefer calling it regional rail because commuter rail is kind of a bad idea. It's a scheduling thing. If you're gonna have the same exact train, same exact rolling stock, but if you run it all the time, it's regional rail. If you only run it during rush hour in the morning and evening, it's commuter rail. And commuter rail only really benefits commuters. If you want to drive ridership on your system as a whole, you do regional rail. But commuter rail is easier to sell as a political idea because you're trying to convince people stuck in rush hour traffic to ride the train, which sometimes is a pretty easy argument. But still, as far as nationalization, I'm not really seeing it as a federal thing. I'm seeing it more as states, snapping up little bits of rail here and there, and inevitably they might, build themselves a decent network. And it might only be a state-owned and operated network, but hopefully they'll have a better relationship with Amtrak than the freight railroads. Because pending some national crisis, the freight railroads are not going to give up their rails. They like the control, they like the power. But as we enter a century of more environmental conscientiousness and energy crises, and again with the decline of trucking, and trucking being more moved onto rails, then maybe we'll start to see the freight lines reinvest in their rail lines, because now they're seeing that, like, hey, if we can make money doing this, maybe we should upgrade our track, increase the track speed. Maybe we should build longer passing sidings. Maybe we should stop doing PSR, precision scheduled railroading. Maybe we should double track some sections and get eastbound and westbound or north and south or whatever the directions happen to be running again. So I like to think that certain market forces can, force the railroads to kind of redevelop themselves and uncannibalize themselves and build themselves back up. This is why I like short lines a lot, because short lines tend to have more people from the ground level make it to the top, and they've seen how things work with their own two hands, and they're not like the BlackRock financial group that see everything as an Excel spreadsheet, trying to make the line go up on graph. So short line railroads can sometimes be a little bit more interesting. I mean, you got the class 1 railroads, and there's like the class 2 and class 3. Class 2 are kind of weird. Forget if the Florida East Coast Railroad is a class 2 or class 3. I'm going to call them a class 2 just because they're a bit more expansive or extensive than most class 3s. But they're the host railroad or partner railroad of Brightline. So, these smaller railroads tend to be more innovative, even if they don't have the same budget as the big railroads, to do interesting things with passenger services. I mean, there's a part of me that says, like, in 20 years when gas is $10 a gallon and the cheapest Tesla is $200,000 and power is at 25 cents a kilowatt hour, then what would it take to get the freight railroads? I'm not going to get into the legality of this, but like, what would it take for the freight railroads like Union Pacific to say, well, we want to get back into the passenger game? I'm sure Amtrak would have something to say about it. They're like, yo, like we were literally like, carrying this torch during the hardest time to carry this torch, and now you just want to swoop in once, passenger rail became more popular again. That's kind of a dick move. But Amtrak's opinions aside, like what would it take for BNSF and Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern and CSX to say, hey, this passenger rail thing, we actually wanted to get some passenger rolling stock and start running passenger trains again on our networks. Like, well, that's just an interesting kind of a interesting thought of like, if the CEOs and especially the investment companies behind them are like, we think that you should re-diversify back into passenger rail. What would it look like if Union Pacific, started running passenger trains again, like they once did? That would be a really weird future to see. And again, like I'm sure if anyone is familiar with the subject, that's very much so a pipe dream, but like still, like it's that what if scenario that's kind of entertaining. Like what would it take to get Union Pacific and other Class 1 railroads to say, hey, we want to start carrying passengers again because we see money in it. We have the extensive rail network, and if Union Pacific says, hey, we've upgraded most of our track to accommodate 200 mile per hour trains where they can, and in places where it's tight and twisty, like we've got tilting technology, and we've done the best we can with signals, and basically done everything that any rail advocate would always want to dream of seeing. Upgrading these rail lines to be the best they possibly can. And they're like, hey, we want to start running passenger trains again. Because we have the network to do it. That'd be very interesting to see. I mean, if I'm being honest with my thoughts on nationalization, I see full electrification as more possible than nationalization. Like, in my list of most probable, at the top of the list is the railroads are going to electrify eventually. It's just a matter of economics. And second to that would be the freight railroads start running passenger service again. I think the freight railroads would prefer to run passenger service if given the choice. If the federal government went to Union Pacific and said, hey, either you start running passenger trains again, or essentially getting what the nationalization wants, where like the federal government would say, Union Pacific, you can either, option one, you can start running passenger trains again. Option two, you can give Amtrak the same priority as your own freight. Or three, we're going to nationalize your railroads. Pick one. I do think that Union Pacific would either go with, fine, we'll let Amtrak, do what they want on our rail lines, whatever. Or they would say, fine, we'll start running our own passenger trains again. They would do those two before nationalizing, if given a choice, if that were on the table. So I'm where I need to be, so maybe I'll do a part 2 on this because I actually still had some more things to talk about. But still, yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on nationalization and electrification. All right, see you guys later.